Okay, so today we are going to be taking the practice TCAP for writing. This is the writing prompt, so whenever you are taking a writing test or an essay, you need to read the prompt first before you jump in and read the passage. That will help you know at least where you are going with your passage and what you will be doing. Okay, here's the prompt. Even though Invention Day did not end the way Steve thought it would, he learned something from his teacher. Write a narrative retelling the story from Mrs. Nell's point of view. Be sure to use what you've learned about setting, characters, and plot of the passage. Follow the conventions of standard written English. Manage your time carefully so that you can plan your response and write your response. Your written response should be in the form of a multi-paragraph narrative story. Okay? So looking at this, you need to write a multi-paragraph narrative. So remember, a narrative is a story. You need to write from Mrs. Nell's point of view or perspective, so you would use first person for her. Make sure you include details like the setting, the characters, and what goes on in the story. Remember, your story should be similar to the other story. You can add your own ideas as well, but the similarity will help you make sure you're doing what you're doing, or what you're supposed to be doing. Please circle the verbs in here and underline like we did yesterday, and when we were practicing working on our prompts. Okay, here are the directions. For subpart 1 of this practice test, you will read a passage or a set of passages and then write a response to a written task. You will have 75 minutes to complete subpart 1 of this practice test. This task gives you a chance to show how well you can organize and express your ideas in written text. After reading the passages and written task, take a few minutes to think about what you've read and plan what you want to write before you begin to answer. Do your best to write a clear and well-organized response. Be sure to keep in mind your purpose and audience when developing your response. If you finish before the allotted time, please review your work. Here's the passage. From Think Like an Inventor by Therese Heckenkamp. It was impossible for Steve to think of an idea for Invention Day. With such mouth-watering smells floating in the kitchen, a full stomach would help him think better, he decided. What are you making, Mom? He asked as he plopped onto the stool at the counter. Too many things, she said with a laugh. Bread, cake, and apple pie. But no samplings, she warned, waving an apple peeler under his nose. These are for the Sunday bake sale. Steve watched as his mom picked up an apple and turned it deftly in her hands, using the little peeler to shave curls of red skin. That's going to take forever, he said, eyeing the waiting mountain of apples. Then he swiped an apple, figuring Mom would probably be grateful. Just what I needed, a volunteer, Mom said, turning and handing him the peeler. There has to be a better way to do this, Steve thought as he scraped the blade against the apple. He kept missing spots. The peeler kept slipping in his hand, and he had to work slowly to avoid cutting himself. Inventions are often created as a result of trying to make a task easier, Mrs. Nell told the class. Peeling apples was a task that definitely needed to be made easier. Steve stayed up late that night, drawing a diagram of his invention and labeling its parts. The crank handle made it look like a pencil sharpener without a cover. By merely turning the handle, you could make an apple turn round and round beneath a blade until the apple was peeled cleanly from one end to the other. Much easier, thought Steve. He knew Mrs. Nell would be impressed. Steve grew so hungry, imagining all the apple pies Mom could make if she had a peeler like this, that he almost sneaked into the kitchen to snitch a piece of the pie she had baked that afternoon. At school the next day, all the kids pinned their drawings on the bulletin board. Steve stood by his diagram, eagerly waiting for Mrs. Nell to congratulate him on his clever idea. Hey, said Jenny, who has been walking around the room pushing his nose practically into the paper as she examined each drawing. What's with this old-fashioned apple peeler? Old-fashioned, Steve scoffed. No way, I just invented this yesterday. Jenny rolled her eyes. Boy, are you dumb? That thing's ancient. My grandmother has one. I'll bring it tomorrow and prove it. Steve crossed his arms and said, Huh. As she walked away, he didn't know what else to say. How was he supposed to know someone had stolen his idea 100 years ago? Then his stomach began to feel queasy. Now Mrs. Nell would think he had copied someone else's invention. That was worse than not trying at all. To get his mind off this, Steve began looking at the other inventions. But that made him feel worse because they were all so much more impressive than his. A shark detector swimsuit, a bed that made itself, and a pencil that knew homework answers. When it was Steve's turn to describe his invention, he shuffled his feet and tried not to mumble the words he wished he didn't have to say. After I invented this apple peeler, I found out it had already been invented. He tried to ignore Jenny's smug smile. Don't be discouraged, Mrs. Nell surprised him by saying. Even though something like this has already been invented, what matters is that you took the assignment seriously and focused on making an everyday task easier. That proves that you truly understand what this assignment is about. In fact, she said with a chuckle, I think reinventing something you never knew existed means that you must have the mind of an inventor. Steve grinned. Maybe I should modernize it with batteries, he suggested. As Mrs. Nell moved to the next invention, Steve decided that tomorrow he would bring her an apple. Okay, so going back to the prompt. Remember, this is what you're doing. Even though Invention Day did not end the way that Steve thought it would, he learned something from his teacher. Write a narrative retelling the story from Mrs. Nell's point of view. Be sure to use what you have learned about the setting, characters, and plot of the passage. Follow the conventions of standard written English. Manage your time carefully so that you can plan your response and write your response. Your written response should be in the form of a multi-paragraph narrative story. Okay, so we don't know a ton of information about Mrs. Nell, so this is your job to kind of fill in the blanks. Okay, you can add your details and what you think may have happened from her perspective. How would she have responded to Steve? What are things that she would have maybe said or thought about during the process? Okay, so you're going to tell the same story from Mrs. Nell's point of view using first person. When you're thinking about what kind of graphic organizer you want to use, you will want to be using something like a plot diagram. Plot diagrams look like this often, and let me get this bigger here. Maybe. If you remember, we did these before in class. The plot diagram would have the background, including the beginning of the story. You want to introduce the characters and the setting. Then the rising action, what leads up to the problem or the conflict. Think about what the problem or the conflict is of this story. Then the climax, that's the high point. It's when everything kind of changes. Kind of when Steve realized that his invention was already made. The following action, what happens after that? He solves his problem or works to make the conflict better. And then the resolution, that's how the story ends up. Okay, if you think about it, at the end of the story, he decided he was going to think about the next invention and really be an inventor because Mrs. Nell had encouraged him. Okay, so those are some things to think about. Draw a chart like a story mountain or a plot diagram similar to this or this one, and then you may get started. Good luck, guys. This should be more than one paragraph. Use dialogue, use characters, use as much as you know from class. Good luck, guys.